welcome to another episode of Total Rankers. This is a podcast where myself, Donal, and my good friend Toby, we talk about music and ranking. And that's pretty much it. That's what we do. Toby, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. I was pretty stoked by our debut performance last week. I think it soared to at least a 6, and I'm excited that there's more to come.
And are you coping well with isolation and lockdown, or are you losing your mind?
Completely losing my mind. Earlier on this morning, I insisted that my family go for a walk, and it's about -4 today, and it was so cold that by halfway through the walk, I'd actually lost the feeling in both of my hands. And yet, that was clearly the right and important thing to do on a day like today.
I thought you meant that you sent your family out on a walk while you stayed at home, and I thought, God, that's a good idea.
That would have been, as Derek Smalls once said, there's such a fine line between clever and stupid.
Well, look, as you mentioned, last week's podcast was about debuts, and it was our debut. Let's hope that resonance isn't quite so profound this time round, because today we're going to talk about flops, but not just any flop. We're going to talk about quality flops. Toby, can you explain to me what you think is a quality flop?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that before you suggested this, it hadn't actually occurred to me that such a thing really existed. When I first thought about it, I thought about it in the context of the cinema, because, right, there are quite a few movies in the history of the cinema which completely flopped, and yet, looking back, are seen as masterpieces. But I'd never really thought about that in terms of albums. And I suspect that's mainly because when I listen to them, unless I really know the artist in an in-depth way, I'm just listening to them and think, this is good or this is bad. I'm not necessarily seeing it in its context. What was interesting about this for me is, unlike last week, where, as we discussed, yes, we were talking about debut albums, but basically we were talking about albums we really liked that happened to be debut albums. This week, I think we can't divorce the album from its historical context.
And its reception, I suppose, the reception that it gets.
Absolutely, because what makes a flop was one of the interesting questions. And I suppose that it could be because the artists themselves disavow it and say, no, this is a bag of shite or whatever. And certainly with one of mine, one of the protagonists almost said that word for word. But actually, you've got to look at things like sales and reception. And I think you've also got to look at it in the context of the arc of that artist's career. Because if your first album sells 23 copies, well, that's not a flop. And if your second album then sells 24 copies, potentially that's a hit. That's progression. I thought it was a really interesting idea, really challenging. The first time I thought of it, when you suggested, I thought it through, and I thought, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I ended up with a list that was too long, which I had to cut down. There are a lot more quality flops out there than I originally thought.
I was also reflecting on it, and I kind of thought expectation is probably the key concept for me. If the artist thinks they're about to change the whole history of music, and don't, that's perfect. Or record companies, fans with great expectations. It seems to me that's one of the key things. And if it's career derailing, then it's a flop, no matter what, I suppose. How much it sales or anything. So it's like there's a set of characteristics of a flop that maybe not all flops share, more like family characteristics, as it were, the flop family. And maybe we'll think at the end about what we've learned about what makes a quality flop. Toby, I'm going to send you off first with the 5th most quality flop of all time, in your opinion.
Well, this one is a sad story. It's a sad story of Liverpool folk in the 1980s.
Oh dear.
My flop number 5 is Liverpool by Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
That's sad.
Now, you and I were about 14 years old, I think, when Relax hit the airwaves. And I wasn't very interested in it. I wasn't really interested at that point in any song that was less than 18 minutes long. And you weren't, I think, interested in any song that had emerged post-1970.
That's pretty much true.
And so, yes, fine. Two Tribes, yes, fine. And I got mildly irritated when there was that thing about, this is the first band that's done 3 number 1s since Jerry and the Pacemakers. Because, of course, that somehow suggested they were better than the Beatles. And
better than Jerry and the Pacemakers.
I didn't really have much of an emotional connection with Jerry and the Pacemakers. But I did with the Beatles. And I remember almost coming to blows with somebody in our class at school over how good he thought Frankie Goes to Hollywood was. So for reasons that actually I don't quite recall now, but maybe just because everyone did, I actually bought the album Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. And having bought it and listened to it, I was affirmed that it is an absolute pile of pants.
It was. I think I borrowed it from you.
It's quite possible.
And because I didn't want to buy it either. I was a bit like, unsure. And yeah, I thought it was terrible.
Other than those two songs, there's actually nothing there. It's like, where's the music? What is going on? I've got my copy here.
Wow.
And because I sort of looked into it, and it is extraordinary. One of the inner sleeves is actually a merchandising order form, which I think must have been a piss take, but it's there. And in the middle, in the middle of the gatefold, there's a quote. It says, "I get buzzed off the fact that Andy Warhol's heard of us because he gets buzzed off the fact that Picasso has heard of him." So,
2 degrees of separation.
yeah, there was a suggestion of some kind of artistic lineage, but Picasso, Andy, Frankie, and of course, there were all the T-shirts and the tote bags and all that, and they were obviously having a really good time. So when I look back on it now, I think actually it is a terrible album, but fair dues, they were clearly having a really good time.
Yep.
Then they released Liverpool as their second album, and again, my recollection looking back is that it was very, very hotly anticipated. It was like Frankie are going to smash it again. You know, nobody else is going to bother recording music or releasing music for about the next 6 months because it's going to be Frankie, Frankie, Frankie. They released a first single called Rage Hard, which got to about number 4. And then the album came out, and then there was just silence. And that was the end of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Now, I have listened to the album, and the thing is, it's pretty good. But why I think it's actually a really sad story is that it's an album of music. All the nonsense from the first album, all the talking and the sort of mucking around, that's all gone. This is actually a rock album, a poppy rock album, but it's very much in that genre of mid-80s, kind of stadium-ish, Simple Minds, U2.
Yeah, Simple Minds all over it. It's amazing.
Simple Minds all over it. And I think this is them saying, okay, we've done all that farting around. We've had a laugh with you. We're actually musicians, guys. We can actually make music. And
that never ends well, does it?
And everyone just said, "No, you're all right, mate."
Don't do that.
And the thing is that it's good. I think it's perfectly good. The first song, Warriors of the Wasteland, is better than anything on Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. And they're a group of perfectly good songs. And I think it always is, if it had been the other way around, if this had been their first album, they'd have maybe got a following that would have allowed them to have a career when people said, yeah, right, this is quite good. As you say, in the same vein as Simple Minds, we'll go along and watch this and jump up and down a bit in the audience. That'll be fine. And you can imagine they would have a career of releasing, like Simple Minds did, basically the same album again and again in a different package.
Yeah.
As it was, because this was not Welcome to the Pleasure Dome 2. That was it. Goodbye, Frankie.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because apparently there's a story that the reason it ended up being called Liverpool, which the band didn't want, was because that's where the owner of the record company thought they'd be after it came out, because he thought it was going to be a flop, which is a bit mean. I was surprised at its quality. I thought it was going to be terrible. I always had a bit of a soft spot for Rage Hard, even Warriors of the Wasteland. I remember the singles. I did end up feeling it didn't quite have the tunes. I just thought their band are playing well. You know, they've got the lyrics are kind of whatever, they're political, they're interesting. The band are playing well. I just thought it just didn't quite have the tunes, but the band were good.
Yeah,
and the production is 80s but impressive. Yeah. I don't quite understand why it was the end for them. I know there was some awful, massive lawsuit, which is, of course, a good sign, though, of a quality flop.
It is. It's not brilliant musically. It has, obviously, for me, a much greater quality than their first album.
Yeah.
And yet, that was it. That was it. That was the end.
But it does have that awful quality of that they want to be taken seriously, and that's just like, exactly. Oh, don't, please, no, stop.
And the fact is that nobody wanted to.
Yeah, well, look at them. The name is Frankie Goes to Hollywood. I mean, how can you take them seriously? It's not the point. But hey ho, quality flop. Definitely a good choice for quality flop there. Shall I embark on my
your
my
quality
version?
flop number 5?
Okay, for me, I've chosen an album I'm very fond of. may be surprised to know it could even be considered a quality flop, but it is the Kinks. The album is the Village Green Preservation Society. Now, why is that a flop? You might say it's possibly their most famous album. Well, it didn't even chart. It sold so badly, it didn't even make it onto the top 100. I think it was released the same day as something like the White Album or something like that. Very out of place sort of album. I love the music. It's very sort of warm. It's a bit like a sort of cup of tea as a record goes, with sort of acoustic guitars and pianos. The whole album cover actually is a kind of colour of tannin. So maybe there was a tea motif throughout. You can say it's about whatever you want, loss of innocence or fear of change. But one thing it definitely is about is people in Muswell Hill. A lot of the characters, Johnny Thunder was a sort of aging rocker. They've changed the names, obviously, to protect the innocent. But Daisy, Walter, these are all characters from Ray and Dave Davis's boyhood in Muswell Hill, which is, of course, an area you and I probably know reasonably well, growing up around the corner.
Wasn't it? And there used to be sort of sightings of Ray Davis from time to time when we were kids.
Yeah, I've sighted him. His mum lives in Highgate Village. I'm gutted because there's a pub where they started, and there's a Kinks tribute band that play there, and every now and then Ray Davis turns up and heckles, and friends of mine invited me. I couldn't go, and he was there, and they said it was a great night with him just shouting at them and saying that song's rubbish. I like the mythology of the Kinks, and he's apparently a really grumpy sod, which is, nothing wrong with that.
I think this is a perfectly good album. I think it's really nice. It's really listenable. But I suppose maybe one of the ways it connects with Liverpool is that there aren't any obvious hits.
Nope.
And most particularly, there aren't any obvious hits in the vein of You Really Got Me, All Day and All of the Night, and Tired of Waiting. So there's this kind of gap between expectation and delivery. And that really difficult. I think this was one of those situations where a band is saying, actually, we'd like to do something different, please, folks. And then people say, maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a few qualities. Right? He wanted to make it a double album, which I think is a great beginning of a flop. Surely he's already a bit disappointed. The single was a very poor choice. They chose, I think, Starstruck, which is actually oddly one of the weakest songs.
Yeah.
You can't help thinking that they'd chosen the Village Green Preservation as a single. It might have worked. Yeah, it disappeared. It did derail their career to some extent. I mean, their bassist left shortly afterwards. They started doing a bit of cabaret clubs in the sort of northern club circuit. So things got a bit rocky at one point.
I like the fact that it's actually called The Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society. A little bit pompous, and that's nothing wrong with that. It was, 1968 was the time to start doing that. Even if you were likely to, at least, if not artistically, then commercially, fall a little bit on your face.
It's kind of sad. And in the small print at the end, it sort of says, we are the Kinks. It says, you are our friends for playing the record. It's rather sad because I obviously didn't have very many friends.
Oh, dear.
But it's a quality flop, Toby. Take us deeper in the world of quality flops.
My quality not flop number 4 is my prog-ish album for the week, which is Us by Peter Gabriel. Now, Peter Gabriel, what a man. This isn't the place for a lengthy diatribe or discourse.
Listen, where else? You tell me someplace it is.
But essentially,
this is the best answer you're going to get. But I respect your decision.
In a nutshell, a man who's never really got over himself. A man who, and I say this as a great aficionado, you just always have this feeling when you say, he wants to be a great artist with a capital G and a capital A. And actually, he's best when he just gets on with it. As one knows, a few albums in the early 70s with Genesis, dancing around with a flower pot on his head and all of that, and that's fine. There was Dressing as a Penis as part of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and a lot of other things. Left there, did 4 really, really interesting, very, very different solo albums between 1977 and 1983. And he really seemed to have understood how to do this because he avoided the dinosaur logo. He was embraced by the new wave. He would do, gigs with the Stranglers. He was pretty cool at the point where most people who danced around with flower pots on their heads were distinctly passé. And then this extraordinary thing happened that he made this album called So, which on the back of Sledgehammer became a worldwide hit. And Peter Gabriel strange, kind of slightly gauche, arty, great artist became a kind of megastar. And he got a movie star girlfriend.
He started to look very much like Robert Palmer, I think.
He did. And one of the things that happened is that even in his solo tours, he'd always dressed up a bit. So there'd been some makeup, or he'd done his hair a particularly weird way. There was one tour when the entire band shaved their heads because Tony Levin, the bass player, had a shaved head. So they all shaved their heads. And I read some interview where he discussed how the music just felt really different because they all had shaved heads. You know? I mean, absolute complete bollocks.
It suggests that you shave your head to listen to it. I don't know if that's...
It made it more intense and meaningful. I mean, complete bollocks, but in a way that a capital G great capital A artist would have to think. And then suddenly he started dressing in rather suave and debonair black on stage, and all the makeup had gone. And it was like, okay, you're kind of embracing megastardom, Peter. And I'm sure his bank balance soared because he'd basically been almost bankrupt in the 1980s. Mega album, mega single. And then in normal Peter fashion, he then goes away and it takes him far too long to come up with the next one. There were 6 years between So and Us.
It's like building for a flop, isn't it? You're getting everyone ready.
He clearly didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to do to follow So. Did he become more poppy? Did he become more funky? What did he do? So he brought out Us, a double album. And it wasn't a flop with a capital F in the sense that it did some business. People bought this album, but there were no hit singles. There was one song which was clearly a Sledgehammer Part 2 called Steam, which isn't very...
It really was Son of Sledge, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it isn't very good. And it was released as a single, and it didn't do particularly well. So that was the end of Us, and that was really the end of Peter's megastar phase. And then it then took 10 years for the album after that. That was absolute pants, and that was the end of him doing anything original.
I read an interview with him when that album came out. He just said, I can't see why it took so long. I feel I've been very busy. I just don't know what I've been doing.
10 years. The album itself is, I think, certainly a lot better than So. I think it stands up with any of his previous work. But why it's quality, I think, is this. The album has a lot of influences of particularly African music and Indian music. The album was released on his own label called Real World, which he had started in order to promote world music. The reason why he nearly went bankrupt in 1982 is because he had totally financed the WOMAD Festival, the World Organization of Music and Dance, who did world music festivals each summer, which, you know, obviously were attended by 4 people knitting their own yogurts. But he was so committed to it that he did it. And if you look at the inner sleeves, are a whole load of reproductions of art from the developing world.
Gosh.
And there is a catalogue listing for the Real World catalogue, setting out all the albums you can buy from all these artists from developing nations.
But like Frankie Goes to Hollywood with the merchandise form.
That's the difference. Exactly. But what a difference. And so in a sense, during the course of those 6 years, he maintained his commitment to exposing people to world music. And that was how he decided he wanted to use his stardom. Didn't really work, but I think 100% for trying.
Okay.
And so for that reason, I think quality bloke, quality flop.
I'd never listened to it before, and I enjoyed it. It started with bagpipes, which I thought I immediately warmed to it. I was like, this is good. Then very dense rhythms. I'm not sure it's necessarily my bag, all that the density and the layers of the rhythm, but I sort of really appreciated it. I thought this is quality, definitely quality. I'm with you on that one.
Very good. So what's your number 4 quality flop?
Okay, I'm going to take us down to Watertown. This is an album by Frank Sinatra. Watertown is a flop because it's his lowest selling album. And he's released a lot of albums. But this is the lowest selling of them all. He apparently never played the songs live, just sort of disowned it, really. And it's a shame. It's my favourite album of his. I think that's because a couple of reasons. The first is the way it was recorded. He always recorded live with an orchestra. And that's how you get the sort of shabba-da-sang swing thing. This album, although he had been in the studio, the orchestra recorded first, and then he was sent the tapes, and that was in New York, and then he was in LA sitting there in the studio alone with his Rothmans, and he recorded the vocals. So there's none of that swing, so it's beat music, and I prefer beat music to swing. So I think it's got that element to it. Also, it was a concept album, a rather loosely defined concept of some guy whose wife has either died or left him. You can't quite work it out. And Frank Sinatra is an actor. I mean, in all his songs, he was famous for taking the lyrics home and really trying to get into the story. And then he comes and it's like his story. But Frank Sinatra is himself a sort of character. It's a bit like Sean Connery. It's like it's not really, it's acting, but you're just being sort of some version of yourself. And that's what he did. Whereas in this version,
I'm not sure Sean Connery ever made it that far.
Have you heard Sean Connery's version of "In My Life"?
No, but I'm going to listen to it
It's like,
now.
there are places I remember. But some have changed. Yeah, so Frank Sinatra normally is playing some kind of cool guy who's a bit furrowed brow. Here, he's actually acting. He really is playing a loser. And maybe the fans didn't like it. Maybe he didn't like it. I don't know. And anyway, it didn't do very well, but I love it.
I know nothing at all about Frank Sinatra, apart from his, every so often rather poor movie roles. And obviously Singing My Way, which was, better in translation by Sid Vicious. But I was amazed by this, because when you sent this through, I thought, oh, blimey, I have to listen to a Frank Sinatra record. And I assumed it would be him crooning, finger popping, being a cool dude, possibly wearing a hat, and would really irritate me. Like that entire genre, I've never really understood it. Never really understood any of it. But this is really weird. It's so dark.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no finger popping. It reminded me of kind of the Pogues at their most slow and depressed. Really, really dense music. And there is no light and dark. It's just dark. And when I looked into it and I found this is a concept album, I think the thing I read suggested that it was about a guy whose wife has left him. What a thing to do a whole album about that. It's absolutely extraordinary. And he must have really wanted to do something very different. And in a similar way to a lot of the narrative that we're hearing, generally people said, no thanks, Frank.
No,
We'd rather you didn't. And it was produced by one of the Four Seasons, Bob Gaudio.
I didn't know that, because I know it was written by a guy who just before this album, he'd written a concept album for the Four Seasons, which I really hope we can find time to talk about some ranking of some kind, because it's quite something too.
Is the album you're talking about Genuine Imitation Life Gazette?
That is it. That is
it. It is downstairs on my shelf. And there's a little bit of a layer of dust on the top, but I will go and blow it off at some point, and we can talk about Genuine Imitation Life Gazette, because I think but this, I thought, thank you for letting me know that it existed, because I will listen to it again when I'm psychologically strong enough to do so.
There we go. Watertown quality flop.
Toby, a quality flop.
What's next?
My number 3 quality flop is Homebrew by Nana Cherry. Nana Cherry is I'm a huge fan. It's quite difficult to be a huge fan of Nana, because she doesn't actually produce very much music, which is kind of irritating. But the music that she does is really high quality. And most people will know Nana Cherry for mainly one thing, which is Buffalo Stance, which was side 1, track 1 of her first album. Big hit. And I remember listening to it back in 1989, I think it was. And it was the right time for me. It was just the point where I was getting more interested in funk and hip hop. And I thought it was fantastic. I listened to the album. I thought it was fantastic. And I thought, yeah, great. I'm going to be a Nana Cherry fan. Very much looking forward to more from Nana. Homebrew came out 3 years later, and it was pretty much a flop. I mean, from that point, again, in a similar way, I think, to what one would say about the Peter Gabriel album, generally people don't know the songs from Homebrew, and it didn't really chart, and the singles didn't chart. But it's fantastic, because what it does is she just stretches out. And she has produced what is, I mean, let's be honest, Raw Like Sushi is basically a pop record. And then she produces her record. And it's deeper, it's funkier, it's rockier. It hits that kind of feel between funk and rock a couple of times really well. There's a song which samples John Bonham's drumming from When the Levee Breaks. And that's, you're 99% there with me already.
Is it the duet with Michael Stipe? It's got to start with the Steppenwolf sample. Oh, that's fantastic.
It's a great tune, but it wasn't what people wanted from her. So essentially it flopped. And, since that time, she's produced 2 albums and contributed on another over the best part of 30 years.
Wow.
But homebrewism,
Peter Gabriel something to aim for.
It really does.
The lyrics were interesting. They were sort of moving between sounded a bit like a domestic argument of some kind with some guy who obviously really annoyed her. Very political statements. It just kind of moved around a lot in a way that I sometimes found a little bit difficult to identify with. It felt very personal all the way through.
Even the title, Homebrew, this is her. It's a very personal thing. It is that thing of that. This is the music I want to make, and a little bit sad.
I just associate Homebrew with my Uncle John and this really sort of undrinkable beer that he makes. Maybe this was the undrinkable album.
Maybe. The trouble is, I don't think that's what Nena was aiming for, but I think it might be, unfortunately, what she achieved.
Isn't that always the story of Homebrew, I suppose?
I think it probably is.
It's a gap. It's that gap. Oh dear. I hope she was pleased with it because it was a good record. I've read some interviews with her. She seemed chipper enough and philosophical enough about the whole thing.
Yeah, no, I think she was. I don't think she ever knew that during that late 80s, early 90s period, I had quite a serious crush on her. I think maybe that would have made a difference. And most particularly, I remember that in about 1991, my friend Nigel, who worked in a bookshop in Cricklewood, told me that Nena had come into the shop. Because that was where she was living at the time, and I was really, really jealous. I did speculate as to whether I should go and get a job in the shop,
or just in any shop in Cricklewood.
Yeah, just on the off chance.
But thank you, Toby, for introducing me to that record. I will listen to that one again. I enjoyed it. It was good.
Good. Okay.
I shall tell you my version. My version of the third most quality flop of all time is an album by a band called Talk Talk, another 80s band, and this album called Spirit of Eden. It's, I think, a flop because it's charted at number 19, which isn't absolutely terrible, but I think the previous album sold 4 million and this one certainly didn't. The record company executive when the album was played apparently burst into tears, and not because he was moved by the emotional statements they were making. And they never toured again. And I think it was definitely a flop. I like it because I think it's a very ambitious record. They used to record sort of a saxophonist for like all day and then use like 3 seconds for the album. They spent months and months fiddling about with tiny bits of music and sound. It's actually, I think, a pop album at heart. There's hooks. The songs always have a very conventional structure, but just weird pop songs and very strange hooks. The singing is more like an instrument really than anything else. The lyrics don't seem to really matter. It's just another sound. There's a lot of space in this music, which I like, and I think it's a great record, a really great record. Well done, Mark Hollis and the boys.
And it followed up from their biggest success, didn't it? I mean, look, I had no knowledge of this album. I had only vague knowledge of Talk Talk. They weren't really my kind of thing. Somebody once gave me a copy of The Colour of Spring. I think I have to say that it hit the turntable a couple of times and then it hit the charity shop.
This album feels like it came a little bit out of nowhere, I think.
You think this one's better?
Definitely. I really like it. Are you not so sure?
It is not quite my bag. I think I can. Let me say this. I think I'm gonna have to edit out a lot of these pauses.
No, it adds to the tension, the tense exchange.
I can see in retrospect
like a Jeremy Paxman interview. I'm going to ask you again and again. Do you like this album?
I don't really. I can see why you might, but I there was a kind of strain of sort of slightly quirky British pop during that period that fundamentally got right on my tits. And I think Talk Talk probably live in that neighborhood for me. People used to get called art rockers. The concept of art rock has always really irritated me. Just be one or the other. And this sense that by calling yourself an art rocker, that somehow you've got a little bit of extra oomph and you can look down slightly on people who aren't.
You're a head start in people taking you seriously. It's almost cheating.
Yeah, and I I feel a little bit bad about condemning them in that way, but yes, it's not hugely my thing.
It wasn't many people's thing. I think that was, of course, part of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I can see, and again, this seems to me to be the common thread. I can see that they were trying to do something else and trying to do something different.
Well, even better than that, they were trying to change the whole sound of pop music forever.
And
so that's a great place to start.
That's exactly why they always got on my tits. Because I suspect I read interviews in Melody Maker in which they said stuff like that, and I was like, and turned the page.
Basically, Mark Hollis, the producer, they holed up in some studio in London for months on end, and all their families, their wives had to threaten them with divorce to get them to come out and actually talk to them. And they really genuinely believed they had changed the whole history of Western music. So, obviously a flop. Thank you, Toby.
Sorry not to be more positive about that.
Enough talk. You do better, Toby. You tell me the second best quality flop of all time, in your opinion.
So my second best quality flop is essentially the most legendary quality flop in the rock and roll canon. The most legendary because at the time it not only took far too long, but it cost more to produce than any other album had up to that time. My second quality flop is Tusk by Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac, let's be honest, a little bit of a laughing stock most of the time. Certainly when we look at them through the prism of history. A decent British blues band, their lead singer and guitarist, lead light, lead everything, goes mad, runs off to a monastery and grows his hair and his fingernails. They struggle through the next 5 years with a number of albums that nobody has ever listened to any of these albums.
I cannot comprehend their trajectory. Exactly. They were just sort of blokes in jeans with long hair, and suddenly they're in LA being superstars. It's like, how did you do that? It's like Mr. Ben just became a different band.
They were dying on their feet. John McVie, basically an alcoholic. Mick Fleetwood, the 15th best drummer ever to play in John Mayall's Blues Breakers. And Christine McVie, the kind of singer who would be fine on an open mic night at the pub around the corner. What were they going to do with their lives? And then so they're sort of dragging themselves through another recording session in LA with half a band because the latest person to sing and play the guitar realised that they would be better off pursuing a second career as a cab driver. In one of those extraordinary rock quirks of fate, they bump into these two people, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, who are both utter geniuses. And it just so happens that Mick Fleetwood has enough brain cells left in his brain to say, why don't you join our band? In other words, why don't you please save our lives and give John enough money that he can drink himself into an early grave? Which, interestingly, he never did because he's still alive. So they then do Fleetwood Mac and Rumours, and they've got more money than you can imagine. And they then concentrate on putting as much as possible of that money up their noses for a couple of years. But for Lindsey Buckingham, all that is not enough. And what particularly got his goat was that, of course, Fleetwood Mac were even those two albums, they became a sort of self-parody as soon as they hit the shelves. A little bit like, I suppose, something like Hotel California by the Eagles. In some sense, it's so good and so perfect that for a vast number of people, it's just going to be the most irritating thing you have ever heard. So Lindsay's not having any of that. He wants to be relevant. He wants to be a relevant... I don't think he wants to be the great artist, but he wants to be a relevant artist, and he wants to be relevant to the people he wants to be relevant to. And apparently, he became a little bit obsessed with David Byrne and the Talking Heads.
Pinnacle of art rock.
Exactly. We're back into the art rock genre. My understanding of what he basically did was lock all the rest of the band in a cupboard and go away and produce this album. Double album. Again, I mean, obviously it shifted millions, because at that point, I think if Fleetwood Mac had done a dump on a turntable, everybody would have bought it. But it was the most expensive album ever produced, and it was panned by the music press. It was panned by the fans, even though they bought it.
It's a very expensive album, and today's money, I think it was $50 to buy the album or something. Extraordinary.
Yeah,
Extraordinary.
Well, but great art don't come cheap.
Or does relevant art, even. I have never heard all of Rumours in my life. I've heard probably every song one time or another, but I've never sat down.
I wish I could say the same.
But I felt privileged actually because I was just approached this album without really knowing what Fleetwood Mac are supposed to sound like. I thought this is a great rock album. I could hear the ones where Lindsey Buckingham has shaved his head and banged toilet rolls or something. I don't know. Those ones stand out.
He apparently used to. He would want to try singing in different ways. So he would sing a whole song lying down, face down on the floor with the microphone close to him to see if he liked the way it sounded better.
And banging tissue boxes or something together, right?
Yeah. There was one. I think it was the demos when he sent them to Mick Fleetwood. He'd done the drum track by banging a tissue box. What was slightly ironic about that is that when you listen to Mick Fleetwood play the drums, most of the time it does sound like he's hitting a tissue box. So the other interesting thing about Tusk, which I think will particularly appeal to you, is that do you know who Christine McVie was going out with at the time?
I believe that she was going out with Dennis Wilson.
She was engaged to Dennis Wilson.
Jesus, that's a bad move.
And the interesting fact, which I think I will hope will inspire you to go back and listen to Tusk all over again, is that the legend is that Lindsey Buckingham persuaded Dennis Wilson to release to him the original tapes of Smile, which he used as inspiration for Tusk.
Very interesting, because that fits with some of the sounds on it.
There's 3 or 4 of the Christine McVie pub singer songs, which you can just ignore them because, there is, with the greatest respect to her, there's that wonderful quote from Spinal Tap. Rob Reiner is doing the reviews of their albums. He's reading the albums, and he says the artistic growth of this band cannot even be charted. And with the greatest respect to Christine McVie, that is what her songs are. A song that she writes today could be a song she wrote 40 years ago. It's exactly the same song. So yes, there's those songs, you know what they're going to sound like, and they're there and they're not surprising. Stevie Nicks, I'm absolutely certain, saved up all of her good stuff because a year after this was produced, she brought out her first solo album, Belladonna, which is, just an absolute masterpiece. And her songs on this are a bit meh. But that's not what's interesting in the album either. It's all of the Lindsey Buckingham stuff that's so extraordinary. And there's these wild jangling guitars and these weird noises. He's like, I'm going to tear the entire edifice down and do what the hell I want.
Yeah, and all the mixes are wrong and the drums are too loud and too quiet. It's just
my favorite is Not That Funny, which comes about halfway through. It does sound a bit like the Talking Heads. And I think what's really interesting is that I suspect that the rest of them by this point, certainly Mick and John, they had shackled their wagon behind the twin horses of Lindsay and Stevie, right? And so they didn't really have a choice but to go with this. Because if it wasn't this, what was it going to be for Fleetwood Mac? They had nothing to offer. They don't write music. They don't do anything artistically. They just play the rhythm section. They had absolutely nothing themselves to offer to this band. Christy,
it's a bit like the sort of definition of a virus, isn't it? The way the virus actually isn't alive. It's just got a sort of structure.
Yes, exactly. They're like the 2 luckiest men in show business, really. So Tusk is legendary for that reason, but it's a famous flop, but it is absolute quality.
It's good. I really enjoyed it, and I thank you. I'm going to keep dipping in and out of it. I don't think I'm just going to listen to the whole thing in one go, unless I'm locked myself in a cupboard.
You'll probably find Mick Fleetwood and John McVie in there with you. So, what is your number 2 quality flop?
Well, number 2 is by Dexy's Midnight Runners, and it's called "Don't Stand Me Down." And this is an album that was their 3rd album. I was a bit of a Dexys fan at one point, and I got the first 2 albums, and I very much liked them. And I didn't buy this one. I think I might have read a bad review, and at that age, that was enough for me. I'm done. I'm not going near that. And I never sort of revisited. I kind of lost interest in Dexys Midnight Runners. But for the purpose of this podcast, I started to delve around, and I'd read about it, and there it was. And I looked into it. It was a flop. Definitely, after the expectations raised by Touré. It didn't chart in the US. The band didn't record another album, essentially broke up afterwards. So that fits definitely. the singer stole the tapes at one point, something to do with an unpaid bill, and he tried to do a getaway in New York from the studios with tapes, jumped into his chauffeur-driven limo, but the chauffeur was having a coffee break, so the limo didn't drive away. So Kevin Rowland was kind of dragged out by a studio executive and had to give the tapes back. Then the label offices caught fire, and for a week they couldn't go in, and he didn't know if the tapes had been destroyed. 2 years of work. I mean, it's a proper quality flop story, absolute carnage. And then it comes out, and people are like, "What on earth is this?"
Couldn't really understand why they did, because as somebody who was never a massive Dexys Midnight Runners fan, I mean, my association with them was, prancing about to come on Eileen at the end of
Exactly.
bad college discos. But in the nicest way possible, this didn't sound any worse than any of the others.
It's got those interminable conversations with Kevin Rowland and one of the bands, which
No, that's clearly a mistake.
So it's a little bit self-indulgent. It's got a 12-minute song, which of course I thought, Toby, you might appreciate, but maybe others didn't. But I kind of like the story probably more than the music. To me it's a good disaster album, but I also think it's probably a lot better than people thought it was at the time.
Yeah, and most importantly for me, one of those things has exactly the same chords as Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon. And as I say, I couldn't, on the face of it, I couldn't see why it had flopped.
Yes, no, I think that's right. I think that it's that thing of time a bit as well, isn't it? You've got to get a move on. I think it took them 2 years to come out. I think that apparently 8 months into the recording, they'd only got 2 songs down, which is great. I think Kevin Rowland was a great man for like 120 takes and all that kind of thing.
I'm beginning to see a theme. Yeah, if you're trying too hard, you probably should stop trying.
So yes, I'm with you. I think they didn't have a single. I think that was the other thing. There wasn't an obvious single apart from Werewolves of London, which of course had already been released by somebody else. Toby, it's time. It's time to hear the greatest quality flop of all time, in your opinion.
My number one quality flop is, of course, Let It Be by the Beatles.
Explain yourself, man.
It's so difficult to know where to start. Well,
I think how can you say it's flop, and how can you say it's quality?
Exactly. The question is, how can one possibly say this has quality? This is the album that John Lennon famously said was the shittiest shit he'd ever heard. It's difficult to know where to start with Let It Be, isn't it? Everything about it is kind of so tragic.
It makes me so tense. Listen to it. It's like watching your parents have an argument. It's just awful. The tension, like, oh.
It is. So in the very, very briefest way, as I'm sure everyone knows, there were lots of sessions, went very badly, produced the pile of shittiest shit. And then this thing happens that I still don't understand, is that they say, let's take a break from these sessions and go and do something else. And in what seems like about 5 minutes flat, they produce Abbey Road with some of the greatest songs ever written. How does that happen? I don't understand how that happens. I suppose, is the explanation, well, that just happened to be the week that Yoko was out of town. It can't be that simple. But I do not understand it. I don't understand. You can spend 2 years coming up with this pile of shitty shit, and you can spend 5 minutes coming up with Come Together, Here Comes the Sun, and then, having essentially split up, they decide to release Let It Be. I think mainly if they've got the movie to do, and it just had to get done. And then, we won't go into vast detail about all the various versions and but what we ended up with was this kind of absolute dog's dinner, mainly produced by Phil Spector, and it lives up to the hype of being the shittiest shit ever. So why is this a quality flop? It's a quality flop because of one thing only. Because Let It Be is redeemed, in my view. And I know this is a high horse you've heard me get on many times, but the listening public haven't. Let It Be is redeemed by something called Let It Be Naked. And very briefly, what happened is that Macca, who always hated this, he hated the Phil Spector versions. He hated The Long and Winding Road, which he's right about. He's not quite right about how much he should hate The Long and Winding Road. He hates the mix of it that Phil Spector did. He authorized the release of the original tapes to these guys who remixed and regenerated the entire album. They took off the horrendous 2 little bits that are Dig It and Maggie May. They put on Don't Let Me Down, which was the B-side of Get Back and's a good tune. And they stripped out all of the nonsense. So Long Winding Road is just Paul and a piano. Interestingly, and I didn't realise this till I was doing my revision for this, I didn't realise that Phil Spector had dropped Across the Universe by a semitone. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
I got to the point where I was listening to the two versions simultaneously, and I was listening to it in D flat on Let It Be and D natural on Let It Be Naked. And Let It Be Naked is great.
And it was like having a new Beatles album, especially the Long and Winding Road that you mentioned, just to hear it the way it should have been. I so enjoyed that. Are you claiming, though, that the original Let It Be is quality? I mean,
yes, I am. But what I'm saying is it is the very definition of the ruby in the dust. That the dust was so thick that actually you've got to go beyond the original album to the original tapes. And you've got to give them to somebody and let them do the songs that as they should have been done. And then you get the ruby.
Because I listened to it again, feeling tense, and I concluded that the songs I liked on it were "I Me Mine." And, I'm a huge Beatles fan, so
yeah,
this is the one album I find really different. I like "I Me Mine," but I actually really like "Dig It" and Maggie May, and maybe Ponder. McCartney came out the same day as Let It Be, his Paul's solo album, and actually that sounds like an entire album of "Dig It." I just found myself thinking I enjoyed those bits. I don't like. I know you like "I Dig a Pony," but I just can't be having it with that song.
I like Dig a Pony.
I
like I've Got a Feeling. Yeah,
that's a fantastic song. Fantastic song. It is. It's a Beatles album. How bad can it be? Well, I suppose here is the answer. It's how bad it's almost like deliberately trying to ruin a Beatles album. Just see, is it still listenable? Which it is. It is. But it's a sad album as well, isn't it? You listen to it and you're like, oh dear.
It's tragic.
Oh dear.
It's completely tragic. I mean, I'm not surprised that the sleeve is black.
Yeah.
And, this is the album that really is none more black. Second Spinal Tap quote of the day. Dig It is apparently credited to Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr. The only one. Oh, there's another one.
Flying, the instrumental. The only Beatles instrumental is credited all for as well.
Right.
I know the Ruttles in their spoof, they called it "Let It Rot," didn't they? And it should have been so good, the rooftop concert.
And it's such a shame that they dismissed the first cover concept. So, the first cover concept, when it was going to be called Get Back, was the copy of them looking down over the banister in the same way as Please, Please Me.
Oh, very interesting choice, Toby. And you got me to listen to it again. I don't know if I'm grateful or not for that, but I did listen to it again. Which was good. And I appreciated Dig It, which I'd always hated. Is there more to say, or should we just let it be?
I think we need to let it be at that point, because otherwise we'll be here all night.
We'll get back to our theme of quality flops. And here it is, Toby. The number one quality flop of all time is an album by Gene Clark of the Byrds, and it's called No Other. Why is it a flop? Well, straight away, it charted at 144 in the US charts, which is terrible. He was a very successful guy in some ways. He'd obviously been with the Byrds. His songs were well known. He himself had never quite taken off in his solo career, but he'd been chugging along nicely, the occasional Byrds reunion and stuff. So he was good things were expected from him. The album cost a fortune, about £500,000 in today's money. David Geffen, who was the record label boss, when he received the album for the listening, he said, "Why is there only 8 songs?" Threw it in the bin and walked out, even listening to it. It totally was the end of Gene Clark's career. I'd never really recorded formally again. He did bits of bobs, but never really made another album. Why do I like it? I like, of course, the ludicrous story and the excess around it. The lyrics came out of lengthy conversations he had with Dennis Hopper and David Carradine of Kung Fu fame, which I think, again, you need to think carefully before you proceed with this project, if that's how you started it. But he obviously thought it was the right way to go.
I get the impression that he thought it was brilliant.
He just was gutted. He really put everything into it, and he could not understand why people did not want 8 minutes of him relaying his conversations with Dennis Hopper and David Carradine over complex, multi-layered musical backdrops. But
I looked up the list of people who played on this album, and it's basically a who's who of anybody who was playing an instrument in and around California in the mid-70s. There are members of the Byrds. There are members of the Allman Brothers. There are members of the Eagles. There are people who played with Crosby, Stills and Nash. There is the ubiquitous Joe Lala, a name that
You've
you
told
and
me
I
about
know well,
Joe Lala.
that we will come back to again and again. Joe Lala was the go-to percussionist in the West Coast of America for a decade, and he's just everywhere. I really like it. You listen to it now, and the songs are really good. The title track is really, really good. The first song, Life's Greatest Fool, is very good. And it is not immediately clear why it flopped. And the only thing I thought is that it's 1974, and I just wonder whether if it had been 2 years earlier or 2 years later, it might have been a hit. Because if it had been 2 years earlier, it would have been part of that kind of first wave of, Laurel County singer-songwriters. Everybody was just hoovering that stuff up. And there were people who released, well-regarded and successful albums in that period that are unlistenable now. Because there was such an appetite for it. You could basically break wind. And if you looked kind of depressed and had long hair and had a guitar and you said that this was your own wind you were breaking, they'd sign you to an album, And a few years later, of course, then when the Eagles had steamrolled this stuff, and so it was, it wasn't that it was artistically credible, it was commercially credible. He might have just found the sales numbers. But I wonder whether he fell through in the middle of that period where actually everybody was a bit fed up with it. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young in 1974 did their famously bad stadium tour where they hated each other so much that it had to be 4 limousines from venue to venue because they wouldn't even sit in the same car. And I think it might have been at that point everyone said, actually, we're a bit fed up with all these navel-gazing, frankly, millionaire dope heads peddling this stuff to us. And I think it's a shame because it is really, really quality.
There is a quote from him which might help us understand why it was a flop as well. It says, "We were trying to make a real piece of art."
Oh dear.
So that could have been the problem. That could have been the problem. No matter how it sounds, just if you're starting from there. But I'm glad you enjoyed it. I thought you would. And
you've been peddling this to me for decades. This wasn't the first
time. I know. Well, you didn't like it. You didn't like it last time. I thought I'd try it again.
Yeah.
Try it subtly.
This time, again. And this time it really succeeded.
It's a great record, and I think it's the #1 quality flop of all time. But I appreciate I may be alone in that opinion. Toby, we've done the flops.
What I've learned this week is there are a number of warning signs, warning lights that should flash up when people have been successful. And one of the things about most of these albums is they come after success. If you're successful and you decide that your next thing is to produce a big artistic statement, that is warning light #1. Don't do it. Warning light #2 is don't make it a double album. Warning light #3 is don't take too long.
Yes.
It's the combination of all of that. I think it's people feeling, now I've got to do something epoch-making. I've got to do something that will be in the annals of music for the rest of time.
Getting taken seriously. Isn't that a strange concept in a way? You should always take your work seriously, but thinking that everyone else should take it seriously too. That's what I don't really understand. And it loses a bit of fun or something.
For me, the juxtaposition is with Status Quo. I don't know whether Status Quo have ever produced either a good album or a flop album. All they've done is produce Status Quo albums. And I suspect Status Quo have never tried to make a big artistic statement. They just carry on being Status Quo.
It's that great difference between taking yourself seriously and taking your work seriously. So Status Quo, I'm sure, take their work very seriously.
Yeah,
but they don't take themselves
professionals
seriously at all. Yeah. No. And it's that moment when you start to think, I want to be taken seriously. And then you start changing what you do to achieve that aim. You're in trouble.
You're in trouble. Big your family's in trouble. Your band is in trouble. Your record company is in trouble.
And the irony is that everyone will laugh at you and not take you seriously, ironically enough.
If you're very, very lucky, at some point decades on, you'll get something like you and me sitting around saying, actually, that's quite quality.
It's quite good.
I just hope wherever all these various people are, well, we know where some of them are dead, but the ones who are still alive, I just hope that in some way they are warmed by the knowledge that we think their flops had quality.
There's only 2 things left. The first thing is you can tell people where to find us, Toby. You know where to find us on the interweb.
You can find us on Facebook at Total Rankers Podcast. You should be able to also find us on Twitter at Total Rankers Podcast. And I believe also, Donal, on YouTube as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. We have a YouTube page channel. I'm not sure, but we have it. Thank you, Toby, for telling us where people can find us. And the last thing to do is talk about the next podcast, which the theme is essentially people who've had runs of 3 albums, good albums, run of three in a row that are good quality. And Toby, you've got another way of describing that. Can you enlighten us?
The legend of the three-peat.
Right.
And it's called the three-peat because nobody has ever won the Super Bowl 3 times in a row. The concept of the three-peat in American sports is a big thing. And so what we're going to be looking at next week is the legend of the three-peat.
Just 3 great albums, or 3 albums we like. Do they have to be good, or do we have to just like them?
It's the same thing, isn't it? If I like it, it's good. If I don't like it, it's not good. My entire life is predicated on that.
That's great. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be hard work because we've got to listen to 3 albums for each rank. Fantastic. Well, look, Toby, I can't wait. Speak again.
Thank you very much. We'll speak next time.